and at the Institute office in board minutes. It was a strategy that worked well. And so I honor that, and if that is original, then so be it. But that's back to the point about what's a book launch. It's you're bearing witness to new ideas. That's all I can offer you that's new. The rest is just my interpretation of what took place. What are some of the highlights of the year, and who are some of the people? A little bit about the project. It was determined that there would be sort of a timeline to it, a sequence. So there are 6 chapters, and they relate to sort of 6 stages through the century of challenges, the war, and the Cultural Revolution of the 40s and 50s, and the challenge of the development plan, that period in the 80s and 90s when the emphasis was placed there on sort of promoting and partnering. And in the last years, the thing that has really caught our attention and really set the Institute apart as a great fundraiser and an organization that supports health, the work that's been done to support equipment drives at hospitals. But so there is a sort of sequence to the chapters. It was also determined that there would be a large element of pictures in it, and so a year ago I started calling around to the institutes, inviting them to submit pictures for the book, and all 94 were contacted. In the end, 69 institutes contributed pictures. Some contributed 1 picture. Some contributed several albums, and I was left to choose. I was left to choose from those albums what pictures I wanted. With all of that material coming in, I lost 1 item. Jeannie Robertson gave me the Mount Mellick material in a lovely canvas bag. I've never found it since. I had some time to kill one day on Queen Street, and I decided I'd take it out of the back seat and read the albums from Mount Mellick. And I think the bag blew out the door because I never found it after that. Jeannie forgave me, and the books were returned, but among the items that came, that went missing. So the pictures that came in, the distribution within the book is not even, but it's as fair as I could be. There is 1 picture from each of 23 institutes. There are 2 pictures from each of 26 institutes. There are 3 pictures from each of 14 institutes, and there are 4 or more pictures from each of 8 institutes. So don't bother tonight counting how many of yours are in there. In addition to those 69 institutes, there are pictures from many, many others, past and present, that were gathered in different places in different ways to represent some of the items that were referenced in the history. So in addition to the written material, that as a source of information, and the pictures, it was suggested that I would, and I knew this would be the case, that I would get a lot of good information by interviewing people. That sounds pretty formal, an interview. I prefer, my age suggests that I didn't interview, I visited. I visited 14 ladies for a good length of time and had a wonderful visit and got a lot of good information. I appreciated that. One of the people that I visited is here in the front row, Alice Curtis. She's already been referenced this evening as someone with a very distinguished, you're smiling, I'm going to tell it. Alice has a very distinguished record of attendance, and I had never met Alice, but anyway, that day came and her daughter-in-law arranged for me to meet her at Alice's apartment, and that was great. We went there, and Alice and I hit it off right away. Within 10 minutes, she invited me into her bedroom. Now, listen, I have to explain. I got to explain that. In In 2008, Marie visited Alice and presented a nice certificate acknowledging, at that time, her 61 years. And since then, Alice has put a beautiful collage of images together in her home, and it's in her bedroom. And she wanted me to see it. I should have said that first, right? So, but anyway, Alice, and remember, Laura's there too, right? We weren't alone, right? No. So we went in the bedroom, and I saw this beautiful collage. It's lovely artwork, and it captures all the highlights of Alice's distinguished career in the Milton, South Milton, I better say South Milton, hadn't I? Yeah, that's proper, because there is a North Milton. Yeah, I'll never figure it out, but I know there is. South Milton Women's Institute. So we saw it. And I'm so pleased that Alice is part of this project, that I got to meet her. I refer to it as a visit. We'll call it an interview, but I had 13 other ladies equally as gracious and as willing to share information about their lives in Women's Institute. And that was valuable. I better have a look and see what I'm supposed to be saying here. Excuse me, Doreen, for a minute. I'm getting along pretty good. Somebody said they were going to tell me when I had 5 minutes left. What the Guardian person asked me what was the greatest achievement of the Women's Institute. I have no hesitation. The building of the sanatorium in 1931 was the greatest achievement of the Women's Institute over 100 years. Why? Prince Edward Island in the 1920s was engulfed in an epidemic. We didn't know it. But we had the highest death rate from tuberculosis in all of Canada, and we maintained that record for a full decade. Through the 1920s, we were losing approximately 100 people, as high as 144 people a year from tuberculosis. There were two reasons. Number one, we believed at that time that rest and fresh air would cure it. So don't tell us we needed a sanatorium, or don't tell us that we needed government to tax us to come up with a solution. We could do just fine in the country if we got up on a hill and had some fresh air and lots of rest. Well, it wasn't working. And it took outside experts, people like Dr. Brink and Dr. Creelman and others, to come here. And in partnership with the Red Cross and the Women's Institute, Islanders, slowly but surely, by the end of the decade, decided that maybe something should be done. And when Albert Saunders became premier in 1927, he turned to the Women's Institute and he said, "You commission a committee to determine the cost of a sanatorium, and you determine if the money can be raised to build it." The government was spending all of $1,000 on health in 1927. You heard Mr. Curry this week talk about the millions. Well, in 1927, it was $1,000. There wasn't even a Department of Health. It took the Women's Institute to bring that about. But a number of people, W.J.P. McMillan, Dr. Creelman, Imogene Much, the president of the Women's Institute, Dr. Hazard, the chair of the Red Cross Society, people like that were the drivers. But the Women's Institute were the foot soldiers who went door to door with literature to explain to Islanders that tuberculosis needed to be wrestled to the ground. It was going to be 1944 before it really got beaten, when streptomycin was discovered. But throughout the 1920s, the campaign was on, and the Women's Institute was leading the way through the countryside, door to door, helping people understand and change their mind. You see, the people were opposed to it because they didn't think they needed to have more taxes to build a sanatorium, or they didn't think they needed government to tell them what to do to cure tuberculosis. It was common sense. It just didn't make, they didn't believe that they needed that. So it took people like the Women's Institute to say, well, here's the evidence. They brought in diagnosticians, that's a big word, but I got it out, and an X-ray machine, and they examined 178 islanders. I don't know why they picked that number, 178. 34 didn't have TB. Figures like that scared people, and eventually the government under Albert Saunders said, we're going to do something. So on June the 8th, 1931, the provincial sanatorium was opened on McGill Avenue. We knew it later in our lives as the Eric Found Center, right? And today the only remnants are a little building beside it called the Mona Wilson House. But she was one of the public health nurses. The public health nurse, the Department of Health, and all those other elements that took birth at that time all came about because of the Women's Institute in partnership with the Red Cross. One of the historians, Ed MacDonald, refers to the Women's Institute, to the Red Cross at the time as the surrogate Department of Health, meaning they were substituting really for the Department of Health. But what my tact is that the Women's Institute were the foot soldiers who went out door to door where it really mattered and persuaded islanders to change their mind. Now, people like George Webster know that getting islanders to change their mind is not easy, whether it's the HST or Plan B or what it is. But through the century, governments learned that the Women's Institute is a wonderful tool to have at your disposal if you want islanders to understand something. They've got the infrastructure to do it, and they've got the attitude that they can do it, and most importantly, they're not in it for themselves. They're in it for home and country. Okay? So the sanatorium was the greatest accomplishment. If we go to the opposite, what was the low point in the century? Well, any organization of this magnitude that has a fire, that's got to be the low point. September 1st, 1957, the Oddfellows Hall, 134 Richmond Street, burned. And in it were offices like the Patriot newspaper, the Federation of Agriculture, and the Women's Institute. And like most organizations, you would never know if you read the records that it ever happened. I don't know why that is, but I've read about fires in the Masonic history that I did a decade ago. Same thing. They had many fires, but they'd never put it in the records that it happened. I think they were so preoccupied with regrouping, finding new place, finding new premises, and so on, that they really didn't think it was necessary to put in the minutes that a fire happened. I mean, we all knew it happened, so why would you put that down for a historian some years later? So I really don't know what they lost, but it was a $250,000 loss, that building. You will recognize it today. The building is still there in a diminished form. It's the lowest of all the brick buildings along what we call Victoria Row. There are, on the south side of Victoria Row, there's about 5 buildings there. There's one that's lower than all the rest. I think it has the Island Dance Academy in it now. And that's where it happened. That would be a low point. I think another low point, although it didn't turn out that way, would be the development plan in the 1960s. That really sent the Institute for a loop, because what happened was school consolidation removed 500 country schools and their school trustees. And communities suddenly wondered what was going to happen next. That's why you see the flurry of community histories being written. They figured they better get the thing written because there's not going to be anything left here if we don't. And that's why Helen Herring put together 19 photo albums of all the churches and schools and halls and mills on the island, because what was going to fall next? 30 of the Women's Institutes closed up shop in the late 60s and early 70s. There still were over 200. The peak for the Women's Institute, by the way, was 1956, when there were 323 and 5,800 members. That was the peak. That was the largest, 1956. So by the late 60s, it was starting to do the downward trend, but not seriously. 30 was not a big concern. But typical of the Women's Institute, it regrouped. And they started looking at what they could do. Let's embrace education. Let's join committees at the schools. Let's establish scholarships at Montague High and at Bluefield High School and at all the high schools across the island. So many branches did that. Let's serve on committees. Let's get on the school committees and do our part. But let's also buy the old country school that we loved and that we cared for a half a century and fix it up, have a card party, take it over, make it a community center. And so they did that from Kingsborough all the way to Enmore West. Lately, they've had to abandon those because the numbers have dwindled. The cost of maintenance is increasing, and we still have, I think, 12 that are operating and funded and managed by the Women's Institute across this province. And they're beautiful buildings, well maintained and well used. So those were the low points. What was the proudest moment for the Women's Institute in all of 100 years? My choice for the proudest moment, actually there were 4 moments. When they could celebrate one of their own becoming a national president. Happened first in Halifax in 1947. Annie McMillan, a nurse, lady who had distinguished herself in the war, came back and married a captain and lived over in Hazelwood in Fairview and went on to become president of the Federated Women's Institutes of Canada for 3 years. Do you know one of the biggest issues she had to deal with as president? Debate over margarine. How times change. And then they were honored to install Florence Matheson of Oyster Bed Bridge in Wolfville in 1964. What a great lady. She opened up the North to the Women's Institute and put her trademark on this world organization.